Hi guys, this is the Definite Article for Grinder School, and today I'm back with the second part of my review of my mate Chris's 50NL Zoom gameplay. We noted some mistakes in the first part, mostly I think due to a small lack of familiarity with minimum defense frequencies, or at least having done the work on spots with wide ranges. So hopefully by the time this video is released, Chris will have got around to fixing those, although I will, of course, I will have sent him the footage beforehand. We're about a third of the way through the footage, so it's probably going to be a 3-part video series. And without further ado, I suppose, let us get on with the video. I should note that although I personally don't use 2.5x to cut off opening size, I don't see anything wrong with it. Jack 9 suited on the bottom right is a pretty interesting spot. We flat on the button pre-flop against an under the gun open and of a nit. Well, he's 13-12 over 6-7 hands, so we're just assuming, as discussed in the last video, about sort of inferences with regards to population means. We're starting to assume he's a nit, though he's probably not quite 13-12 nitty. And a call from a middle position fish. We also have a fish fishes in the small blind and big blind, although I'm not sure why the small blind is marked as a fish here. He is 24-20 over 300 hands. On the flop, which checks to his. Now I think we can pretty much exclude most better hands from under the guns range. Although he seems nitty, I still think he'd be looking for value from the 2 fish in the pot with Queen Jack, plus sometimes he might check Jack 10, sometimes he might actually check Queen Jack, King Jack, but I think that's going to be rare. And I think likewise middle position is going to be betting most of the times, which is stronger than us. The big blind is uncapped here, I think, because I think he'll start by checking nearly all of his range. But given he is 29-10 over 50 odd hands and has a ridiculously short stack, I don't think we're overly concerned about his range. So these would, I suppose, give rise to a prima facie assumption that betting is the way to go. I think that one potential argument to the contrary, which doesn't really apply in this situation, and I will say why after I've given the viewer a chance to think about it, is that if we bet Jack 9 here, then all of a sudden our checking range becomes very weak, and it's going to be tough for us to defend very much at all on turns and rivers. So I'm going to give the viewer a second to think about why that might not be such a negative consequence in this spot in particular. You can pause the video if you want. Okay, I'm hoping you thought about it. The reason why is that there are quite a few related reasons. Firstly, we doubt that any of these players are going to be capable of exploiting our weak flop checking range, or even really paying enough attention to notice it. That's pretty key. Secondly, we're multi-way. It's pretty tough to target exploitation towards a particular player when you are multi-way, because other players in the pots can counter exploits, even if the person you're exploiting in the first place isn't really paying attention and is just happy to continue getting exploited. So people can't really make huge exploitative deviations to start really owning it on turns and rivers. Thirdly, I think it's somewhat less relevant. The board is relatively wet, and our hand needs protection. So in a vacuum, we are actually pretty nervous about the consequences of checking. I'm not certain that the flop sizing here is great. I think it could be a little bit bigger just because we have such a wet flop. And also, if we look at the big blind stack size, given the effective rake, if the big blind calls and any of the two folds, which given the relative strength of ranges, is going to happen more often than going heads up to the turn with any other player, we're actually going to end up with quite an awkward turn SPR of about 1.1. While this is fine on blank turns because our opponent should be capped after check holding the flop and we can just bomb everything pretty much, on turns which hit stuff, this is going to be problematic because we're not going to want to bet 1.1x pot with much of our range, even against a fish. So for instance, if we have ace jack here and the turn is the 9 of spades or the king of diamonds or even the deuce of diamonds, then we don't really want to shove the turn for 1.1x pots. But we also don't want to be giving a free card in most of the situations. If we bet small, then we get if we're not betting some absurd size on a turn, then we get quite actually an absurd river SPR. So we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place if we do get heads up with a big blind, which is, as I said, is the most likely situation if we see a turn. For what it's worth, I expect Under the Gun to be calling pretty much never, just because his range should be very weak after checking with a fish in the pot, and our range is both uncapped and looks strong. So not only is he if he isn't really thinking about how range interacts, he's really going to have a hand that's got a good enough absolute strength to call. But if he is thinking about how range interacts, he's going to understand that we can barrel turns and rivers very aggressively. So if anything, he ought to be defending almost less than his required share of minimum defense frequency. I don't think we need to be bluffing this river with King 9 against the fish. There is a lot of stuff that we beat. We also have a lot of worse stuff now. Of course, have opening range to bluff this river with, so we should have hands like 8-6 of diamonds if we want river bluffs that we would check the flop and turn with. We also have 7-6 of diamonds, 8-7 of diamonds, and all those hands in spades and clubs as well. And there's just a ton of combos that we can use for bluffs here. I think King 9, it's just too wide. And I mean, also, it's one of those spots where we don't really achieve anything because we can't really be certain that the fish is going to fold any pair, even a 2. But also, he's probably not going to call with worse King High very often. I think it's pretty clear that ace-3 suited has to be a check in the bottom right. I think we can probably with the fish in a big blind, I think flatting ace-3 suited in a small blind is fine. We can probably 3-bet as well. Against this flop sizing, I think we should just be calling. And indeed, it's not the greatest board to have a check raise range on because we are going to struggle for value combos because we have ace-7 suited, ace-3 suited, 7s and 3s. From what I remember about this pick side I've got, he has a bit of a sizing tell, so I wouldn't be surprised to see ace-king recess a whole bunch for the time here. But with that said, I still think our hand is too strong to fold. Given that we need to be right about 40% of the time. Not even that. Yeah, about 30% of the time. there's not much going on at the moment. Unfortunately, I don't think there's really something that I can bring up as a quick topic, though I think it's quite interesting. I think the fold here in a second with fours is good, but I think it's a fold that a lot of my students I know wouldn't make until I managed to correct the issue. The reason being that against regulars in 2014, it's getting tougher and tougher to be able to call for set manning purposes only, in that they're simply not going to pay us off enough for us to have the implied odds to call. There are some other related concerns about calling fours here, in that we become quite vulnerable to squeezes, and some balance-related concerns with our range, such as the idea that we start to only hit high card boards with a very low percentage of our range if we do start calling hands like fours here. And also, on a related note, it's going to be very tough to defend most boards sufficiently enough against c-bets. I sort of mentioned this on a related topic in the last video. It's going to be tough to defend a lot of boards against c-bets just because we have so many underpair combos which just have to pretty much fold all the time. And this adds a whole ton of dead weight that we have to justify by calling more with some more marginal hands. In general, as you'd expect from someone at 50 zoom, I think most of your pre-flop strategy is pretty sound. Ace-9 suited I think is a fine call against the 3-bets. It's pretty high in a small blind opening range. It's quite a small 3-bet, we're getting good odds, and if we hit an ace or a 9 we're often good. Considering he probably isn't using, or at least he shouldn't be using, ace-x hands for his light 3-bets here. Although I suppose that would only increase the chance of our dominating his holdings, because he wouldn't be using ace-10 as a light 3-bet. But on this flop, I think ace-9 of spades in particular is just something that we don't need to be defending. We should have some one-heart combos, so ace-queen with the hearts, ace-jack with the hearts, king-queen with the hearts, maybe king-jack with the hearts, although sometimes we fold or 4-bet that pre. We also have a lot of one-pair hands. It's going to be quite tough to defend precisely often enough, but we have to remember that our ranges for flatting out position in these types of spots aren't actually that wide, so we don't have to find a whole ton of combos to defend with. Against two players who are likely to both be weaker players, I think Jack should be a c-bet for value here, or at least for value / protection. I think we can get called by worse, any 7, any gut shots, any 4, some ace high. If they don't call ace high, that's also a good result because we're denying their equity. And also there aren't a ton of queen x in their ranges, although if we were 4-way or there was a reg in the pot, I'd be much more inclined to check. If we were 4-way, that would be because the chance of someone else having queen x would go up by that much, and also each player's required defense frequency would go down to that when we were called, it would be more likely that they had queen x at any given percentage of the time. The percentage of hands in their calling range, which pieces would go up. And if there were regs, then I'd be concerned that if we were betting this all the time, that our checking range would become too weak. As played, I think calling is pretty mandatory. And you've just seen a note that he 3-bet called and called a 4-bet with 10-8 suited, so I think we can pretty much assume he's a monkey and just stop and just value bet this river for like $5.50. Although I actually think he played the hand quite reasonably, despite him clearly being a bit of a monkey. Although I should note that there are some situations in which I personally would 3-bet and then call a 4-bet with 10-8 suited, so it's not something that's necessarily bad, it's just that 99% of the time that you see someone play with that tag, then they will be bad. So 9s here. It's a tricky board to play at 50, and I would zoom in particular, just because most of the time you don't know how much your opponents are going to suck. And that sounds a bit odd, so let me explain. Against very competent opponents, I don't think you should have a check-raising range on this board, big blind against cutoff. The reason being that our opponent clearly has a range advantage on this board. Not only do they have aces and we don't, they have ace-king and we don't, but they also have jacks and we don't, they have kings and we don't, and given he 3x pre, there's a decent chance that we're folding queen 10 off pre, whereas he isn't, so he has 12 more combos of queen 10. Furthermore, ask yourself what categories of hands you're going to be bluffing with here. So maybe 10-8 suited, but A, that's only 4 combos, although I suppose you only really have 7 legit value combos here, maybe the king-jack combos as well. But also it falls foul of the sort of test for deciding whether your hand is a good bluff raising combo I mentioned in the last video, of whether it's either a draw that's strong enough that you want to stack off with it, or you're reasonably happy stacking off with it, or it's a draw that's sufficiently weak that you don't mind folding with your 3-bet. And 10-8 suited here wouldn't really fall in either of those categories, although it's somewhat weaker than a lot of other open-ended straight draws, because A, it never makes the nuts, and B, on a queen, the action is going to be killed a lot of the time. But apart from these 10-8 suited combos, you're pretty much looking at hands which I mostly think play better as a check call. So ace-queen if we don't 3-bet it pre, which we might not against a 1914 player. Ace-10 I think plays better as a check call. And then I suppose for gut shots you're looking at queen-8 suited with a backdoor flush draw. And that's if you have it pre, which you might not, and then you're a bit stuck. Because hands like 8-7 suited here are just shit. If you hit a 10 on the turn with 8-7 suited, you're probably going to have to check, because there's going to be plenty of queen x in our opponent's range, and thus it's not going to be strong enough to value bet, despite hitting the jing card for it on the turn. So just to quickly summarise for this hand, because it's quite an interesting spot and it's quite a complicated spot to deal with. There are 2 main reasons why I wouldn't have a check raising range on this board on flop. Firstly, because our opponent pretty clearly has a range advantage here, and thus theoretically it doesn't make sense to have a check raising range. And secondly, because it's quite tough to develop a range which is appropriate for bluffing, especially while also keeping our bluffing frequencies in check. With that said, against shit regs, I think we can just raise our value hands here, because they're going to see that the board's quite connected and just automatically assume that we have a lot of gut shots without really performing any critical analysis on what our pre-flop range actually is and how it does actually connect with this board. So yeah, interesting spots. I think we could probably just 2.5x our weaker hands against fish when we're in a small blind, and 3x our stronger hands, maybe 3.5x. But I don't think it's something that's going to make a big difference to your win rate. But especially as Zoom, fish in particular, I'm going to be taking detailed enough notes to notice this, though some of the more attentive regs might start taking notes whenever you use a non-standard small blind opening size. I know I certainly do, and thus would notice fairly quickly. So I think Jack 3 is pretty close, despite the fact that our opponent is folding the big blind is folding a ton of steals, because the small blind was folding a more reasonable amounts. With that said, it's probably okay, given the big blind is playing so exploitably. I think given our opponent's stack size and the fact that his name's written in block capitals, with this Giannis guy in the bottom right, we can just assume he's a fish without checking how many tables he's playing. So yeah, I think there are a few tells for when somebody's a fish. Well, aside from them having fishy stats or doing something fishy in game, firstly they might have less than a full stack, especially less than a minimum buy-in stack, which indicates that they can't have auto rebuy on at all. They might have a significantly lower VIP level than is standard for the games and have it displayed. So at 50 an hour, I would also assume that anyone silver star and lower was likely to be a fish. They might have a somewhat fishy image. So there's an image of a koala which pretty much, I'm sure you'll know it if you've seen it, which pretty much is a guarantee that your opponent's going to be fish. If they have a picture of playing cards, they're probably going to be a fish, especially if it's aces, or 7 deuce, or ace king. If they have their name written in block capitals, they're probably going to be a fish. Often if they have a name which directly relates to poker without being a slightly more advanced concept, they're likely to be a fish. So someone who is called Poker Races 111 is probably going to be a fish, whereas someone who is called I Hate GTO 111 probably isn't. So that's probably quite a useful thing to think about. I'm not sure how much attention our viewers have been playing to the ace-queen hand, but I think it's been pretty well played. Without going into detail on our opponent's stats. I don't like 3-betting king-jack suited here. Our opponent is folding 50% of 3-bets, so they're probably defending pretty standard ranges. That includes a lot of hands which are going to dominate king-jack offsuits, and it doesn't barrel particularly well when it misses, given that it's unsuited. And a lot of the boards that flop straight draws on are going to be pretty solid for our opponent's range. So our opponent probably has ace-jack, they probably have king-queen, possibly ace-king in their pre-flop range. They have a ton of suited combos which are going to play better than king-jack, and also it's not like we're struggling for better combos to bluff with here, considering it's going to be quite tough to justify profitably flatting with hands like ace-5 suited and small blind, which I think is a better bluff in this spot. I think on this board, king-jack should just be a give-up. Our opponent is folding a decent amount of c-bets, but this is a board which crushes his range as a pre-flop caller so hard that we can probably adopt an explosive strategy of pretty much betting close to only value and some of the stronger bluffs in our range. I know this in some of my early videos to those of you who are have been following Grinder School. I have c-bet a lot of boards like this. I think it's a mistake that I've made in the past, mostly for the reasons that I've explained, but also because after 3-betting getting called, it's often very frustrating to miss the board, which I'm sure you know, and that was something which used to affect me more than it should. So yeah, for those reasons, I think this shouldn't be a c-bet. Though I think having a c-bet, I think we want to be double barreling this. As the turn sizing is actually quite an interesting thing. Here we leave 13 to 40, which is absolutely fine on a river. You see, we have competing interests depending on the sort of rivers which can come here. On rivers which can complete a lot of draws, we don't want a whole lot behind because we don't have a whole lot of bluffs in our range. On rivers which complete no draws, we have a ton of bluffs, so we do want a lot behind. And we have to balance those interests on balance our own interests on different rivers. I think it's to a degree a matter of analysis of how often certain rivers are going to come and how much an optimal bet sizing for one's range on those rivers would differ from the bet sizing that you'd use as a mean across the entirety of all rivers. I think here there are actually a lot of rivers which complete a lot of draws, so any 8, any 9, any jack, any king, any club. There are a ton of rivers like that, so I think we should probably be looking to make it a little bit bigger on the turn for that reason. On an offsuit deuce, maybe not, but at the same time we wouldn't be barreling king jack on an offsuit deuce, hopefully. So king 7 is something that would be an exploitative fold here. Assuming we're going to be c-betting most 9x plus here. We don't have many jack x or check call on the flop because jack 10 we're going to c-bet, jack 8 we're going to c-bet, king jack we either c-bet or check fold most of the time. So we basically only have ace jack, which is jack x or jack 7. And then once we've got rid of a few 9x and a few jack x, we probably don't have any strong draws here because we'd see about those ourselves. We might have some nut flush draws which we'd want to check call again, but there aren't again that many combos, so king 7 is still pretty high in our range. With that said, when a Russian guy bets big, especially one of the bad Russian guys like Wild Bill, I think he's Russian, I can't remember, I think we can often consider overfolding. So for that reason I think king 7 becomes very close on this turn. I can't blame you for taking either action. Queen 9 I think should be a check call here, unless we have some read that he's folding too much to flop raises. Pretty much for the same reasons that I've discussed about constructing flop check raise bluffing ranges in the earlier video and earlier in this video. I think Queen 10 seems pretty standard. I think better regs will be checking their range in the small blind spot on this turn with Queen 9, just because Hero tends to have a fair amount of 9x in his range, whereas a c-bet has basically none, and then pretty much only has a few combos of 4 houses which beat 9x. And it's tough to really get a betting range when Hero has quite as many combos of 9x as he does. I mean, 9-5 suited is probably a call pre blind against blind, so we probably have up to 9-5 suited and 9-7 off, so that's a whole ton of 9x combos. Against a huge 3-bet, we can fold 8-6 suited blind against blind. Yeah, so I think his play is pretty reasonable. I'd just be folding Queen 10. It's pretty low in our range, and we don't need to be messing about without any reads that he's doing something exploitable. Yeah, so I'd have taken a note on this Martek guy. So now in this video we've seen him 4-bet to 3x or more of the size of the 4-bet to 3x or more of the size of the 3-bet twice. Just going to pop back for a second, and I think that's likely indicative of someone who doesn't have many 4-bet bluffs in their range or is just a complete spazzer. You fold 9-6 suited blind against blind here, especially, which I think especially against the fish is not good. I think 9-6 suited is a very easy defend. Especially, I mean, again, especially against the fish, because we rate to be better than them post flop and we want to exploit our post flop edge in as many pots as possible. I think the best play with 9-6 suited is probably 3-betting here, and I like that you're doing it. It's probably just about good enough to call, but it's not a great hand. It's not going to be a hugely plus EV call, and it's a type of hand which plays pretty well in 3-bet pots, big blind against button. So Queen 6 suited is completely grim here. We're calling for a chop because with the speed of under the gun's call, I don't think he ever doesn't have a 6. But on the other hand, to not be winning, we only actually lose to 6-9. And I think we can effectively exclude 9-6 from under the gun's range based on a timing tell. I don't think he'd be snap calling the river with 9-6, rather considering raising or calling, as in sticking the rest in or calling. But I think we have to be concerned that this may actually form a fairly substantial part of the big blinds range. Both under the gun and us can be perceived to have a reasonable amount of 6x in our range. So if he's just thinking in terms of, I want to target specifically the 6x portion of my opponent's ranges when he has 9-6, then that's the sort of rationale that could lead him to this bet size, whereas I can't think of any other reasonable explanation for using this bet size. So it's a very tough spot. I mean, folding is obviously neutral EV. I think calling is going to be close to neutral EV, to be honest, because I don't expect him to be spazzing so often that we can expect this to be a hugely profitable call. Equally, I don't expect him to have a whole ton of 6-9 pre. Especially considering we have a 6, and especially considering he bets a normal size on the turn. So yeah, I think you should probably at least be considering that. Well, you should be considering that river decision for a little bit longer. Something that I forgot to mention, which I suppose sort of edges is in favour of the call, is the concept of implied blockers. Because of what I mentioned about the timing tell of under the gun indicating that he very often had 6x and rarely anything else, we can assume that 9-6 is often blocked to a certain degree from the big blinds range, and thus he's more heavily weighted towards the spaz in his range, not just because of the 6 in our hand, but because of the 6 or 6 is likely to be in under the gun's hand. And I think that's a concept which I've rarely heard of discussed. So to be honest, I'd be quite proud to be the first to introduce it to the poker world, but I'm sure I'm not, because it's fairly intuitive. And if I'm not, there's probably a name for it already that's not implied blockers, although it should totally be called implied blockers. Excuse me a second, I need to wet my whistle. The video has probably hopped back a bit because I realised I'd left the video playing for a few seconds when I was just getting a quick drink there. So yeah, I just thought over adjusting back would be better than leaving some of the video skipped. Yeah, just quickly looking at time periods, we have roughly 10 minutes, maybe a little bit longer left in this second video and about 20 minutes left of the source footage. If this runs over 3 videos, then I will probably just make the third video an extended video, so maybe an hour to an hour and 10 minutes long, just because I think it's going to be more satisfying to watch the conclusion of a recording of an entire session than part of one. Or at least I always used to get a little bit frustrated when I saw leak finders on training sites and they would not be of the whole video. I think you've got the right idea here, Chris, actually. I think against fish we can just be adding a big blind or 2 to the 3-bet size and be happy with it. And I'd just be betting a normal size on this flop, because although we do block a lot of the hands that he's going to call with our kings, against most fish we can't expect him to go crazy if we start checking, and also on this section in particular we can expect him to call with any gut shots, which he has a whole ton of pre. I think we can expect him to have nearly all combos of Ace-Jack, Ace-10, Jack-10 and 10-9. He can also have a ton of Queen X combos and some 5X combos. He might not fold some naked ace high often, and who knows, he might call with like 5-4 or whatever. So I think we can just bet a fairly normal size, because I don't expect him to be particularly elastic between the 45% and 55% pot region. Again, because he's got less than 50 big blind stack, which is a minimum buy-in at Zoom, I think I'd just be starting by assuming that he is a weaker player. I think King Queen off would make a fine 3-bet there, although it's good that you are looking behind you to see whether the player behind you might affect it. Although the particular player you were looking at, I don't think it's a particularly big concern if they start jamming, because we don't expect to be losing a ton of money when that happens, because as a fish they're probably going to be doing it with too wide a range, and thus we can possibly call King Queen. I think it can be distinguished King Queen in that spot with the King Jack small blind against MP earlier, because we are going to get called more often when we're out of position, and thus post flop playability with our 3-bet range matters more when we are out of position compared to in position. I think we want to be betting about 150 on this turn. It's quite a wet board. I think that I'd be surprised if you bet this size with your value hands here. And as I said before, in relation to this guy, he doesn't seem like a fish based on his stats. Queen 9 suited can either be a 3-bet or a fold there. Depends on how wide you want to be 3-betting in the small blind against the button. Again, 7-5 suited can either be a 3-bet or a fold. Yeah, so again, I'm not really liking the strategy of using ace offsuit broadways for 3-bets here. Small blind against middle position. I'd rather have some hands which are more playable post flop, so suited connectors, maybe some of the suited broadways that we can't prosecute flat, so Queen 10 suited. But with that said, this would change if we were squeezing as opposed to merely 3-betting a single opener, because we could profitably flat more often with the speculative hands, which had the post-flop playability that I'd want for 3-betting in that case. And also, when we do squeeze, we reach the flop with a lower SPR than in a simple 3-bet pot, which is more favourable to hands which make top pair and which aren't particularly speculative. I think I might have missed something in his 8 hand because I'm not sure how the pot should have got this big. So I'm a little bit concerned about that, but being cognizant of the fact that we are getting close to the end of the second video here, I'm not going to run back and dash through it. Yeah, I have no idea what you're doing here. I am actually going to go back through this hand just because it seems very weird. Yeah, so sorry, we're actually going through about a minute worth of footage. Okay. So, there's a Queen 9 hand, 8's in a big blind, there's King 9 and 5-7 suited again. And we were talking about the Ace-Jack hand, and that's why we didn't particularly see the 8's hand in the bottom right. So the cutoff opens to 3x, you've got him tagged as a fish, again I don't know why, because he's 24-19 and he's raising pretty standard raise first in percentages, and I think this flop should be a check fold of 8s. Our defense range cut off against, big blind against cut off is going to have lots of Ace-X and King-X. So we don't really be defending particularly wide pocket pairs. We also have Queen 10 suited, Jack 10 suited, Queen Jack suited, which I think are preferable defends over 8s. And we probably have up to 10s, possibly Jacks for pocket pairs. So there are at least 12 combos of better pocket pairs to defend than 8s. I think calling Queen 10 suited is pretty margin against under the gun, for what it's worth. Although the fact that there's a fish and again he's a nit, not a fish. You need to get your attack sorted out, mate. Is marginal but possibly fine. Here with 8s, I think we're still at the bottom of our range when we check. So I think, well, I don't think I'd want a raising range here as you do. So I think just folding is probably best. Yeah, and I really think this is just bad because I think after the turn checks through, we should be betting most of our value hands on the river ourselves. Because this guy isn't actually a fish, you might be deceiving yourself based on your tag. He probably knows that, and he can probably talk himself into some relatively thin calls. And realistically, you actually block a lot of the hands you want to fold, I suppose, in case he just has some random Queen 8 or 9-8, but really 8s don't block any of the hands that he's going to call with, although I'm not really sure what blockers in that respect you can have, except maybe a 6 or a 7 because it blocks sets, although they should be betting both flop and turn. But yeah, I do think the river jam is very bad, mostly for the fact that you don't play any value hands like that, or if you do play any value hands like that, you're making a big mistake, I think. So on that note, I'm going to leave the video there for now. I've been Definite Article for Grinder School. Good luck at the tables.